Baby mine, don't you cry.
The early life of filmmaker Walt Disney was not an easy one. He had a sometimes turbulent relationship with his parents. His childhood, dogged by poverty, was often only relieved by his love of classic European fairy tales. It was these fairy tales and fables, many of them dark and pessimistic, that he chose to draw on when he became an animator in the 1920s. Throughout his career, he would continue to combine these European stories with the 20th century art form he did so much to pioneer, film animation. He returned to them many times in both his early short films and later in his classic features, Cinderella, Sleeping Beauty, and Snow White.
And if they knew
30 years after his last fairy tale, the studios that bear his name have returned to that tradition and are soon to release Beauty and the Beast, their most recent treatment of such a tale. In tonight's Omnibus, with footage never seen before from the Disney vaults, we chart the developing relationship between Disney's animation and his very American vision of the fairy tale.
but just the right to hold you.
Since the beginning of mankind, the fable tellers have not only given us entertainment, but a kind of wisdom, humor, and understanding that, like all true art, remains imperishable through the ages.
Hi-ho! Hi-ho!
Dwarfs' names fit their personalities. This pompous-looking individual is Doc, the self-appointed leader of the group. And this little fellow is bashful. He's secretly in love with Snow White.
Oh, gosh.
And you? You're sleepy.
Hard to guess.
And you? You're sneezy.
Hi-ho! 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 It's home from earth we go. Hi-ho! 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 Hi-ho!
The Team Disney building that overlooks the current Disney studios in Los Angeles is a testament to the power and longevity of Disney's version of the fairy tales. Versions that have become definitive for 5 generations of children.
Walt was kind of a kid at heart. I think he loved telling stories. He was hypnotic as a storyteller. And I think those kinds of stories sort of were easier for him to tell.
Hi-ho! 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 Hi-ho!
I suspect the real influence on him was just having been a little boy read and having had fairy tales read to him. And he was aware that this was a ready-made source of stories.
It's sad and lonely, wishing well, longing for someone you never see.
Walt seemed to understand, in terms of films, what the common man, woman, or child would respond to. What Walt thought seems to strike a responsive chord in most of the audiences of that day, and indeed of all audiences since then.
I'm wishing.
Disney's earliest films were made in the 1920s in a tiny studio in Kansas City. They show a young animator learning his craft and experimenting with a new art form. It was during this time that Disney started work on his first series, 6 shorts based on favorite fairy tales from his childhood. The laughograms, as he called them, haven't been seen for many years.
tales were ideal for Walt, I think. He wasn't tied down in any way. He wasn't doing something where you take somebody's novel and you have to follow the thing pretty closely, or people don't feel like they're getting what they expected. Well, I think they gave him a chance for his imagination to play.
Puss in Boots is quite an interesting film because it was done by a very young man. I think he was about 20, 21 years old when he did it. But there's a surety about it in terms of the direction. It looks very much like the films that were coming out of New York at that period. It's very self-assured. It has a lot of juice in it, a lot of good gags, and there's also some real attempts at production values. The characters run in a figure eight, the king chasing the boy around, and it's perspective animation, which is rather difficult to do, and they repeat it several times to make sure that you do see it, but it's got a lot of wonderful things in it.
Well, it's hard to judge the Laugh-O-Grams because there aren't a lot of them left. What makes them interesting is that they contain animation Disney did himself, because basically they were done by Walt and Iwerks in the beginning, and then they was gradually able to add another artist or two. And they had taught themselves to animate out of a book and by experimenting and looking at even earlier silent films. It's very obvious that these are people experimenting and learning how to use the medium and how to present the story, but they're really not sure how to do it yet because they haven't done it before. Very chaotic films were made, and if you had a fairy tale as sort of a theme, you could be sure that the audience would be, if not an entire jump, at least half a jump ahead of you and could follow whatever business the animators had invented to sort of fill the airtime. So it was just a good source of material for him.
He was a very, rules-oriented person. And I think the fairy tales offered him that sort of structure. There's a good and there's a definite bad. And he did that throughout his career. He used that sort of black and white quality throughout. He always wanted to be doing something with Alice in Wonderland from the very earliest days. The thing that got him a contract with Margaret Winkler, who was Felix the Cat's distributor and Max Fleischer's distributor, was the test film that he sent of Alice in Cartoonland, which was the reverse of what the Fleischer brothers were doing. In Out of the Inkwell, it was a cartoon character in a real world, and here it was a real little girl in a cartoon world. I think he was a restless experimenter. And when he discovered something, he wanted to plus it, as they said at the studio, or embellish it, or go further.
In 1923, Disney moved to Los Angeles, where he would eventually run one of the largest animation studios in the world. It was here he created another innovative series, the Silly Symphonies. Based mainly on fables, it continued his pioneering experiments in animation, including the introduction of color.
All of the colors used in Disney cartoons are manufactured right here in the paint lab. In fact, it's doubtful if any paint store could supply 2,000 colors and break each color down to 5 shades. It's all part of the day's work for these girls.
There had been some early experiments with color film during the 20s, and none of them had been terribly successful. Disney was always out to advance animation, and when he heard about Technicolor, he came to an agreement with them that gave him exclusive use of it in animation for 2 years. once they had color and the ability to bring color to their films, they could begin to experiment with more styles of artwork. They could begin to do things with color and design that would bring in the look of traditional European storybooks, the kind of detail and intricacy and look of artists like Rackham and Dulake and Nielsen and the people we think of as the great 19th century illustrators. Probably grew up with storybooks like that, knew that much of his audience would have, and wanted to keep a look that they would recognize as appropriate to a fairy tale. One reason a lot of the silly symphonies are based on fairy tales is that, once again, they were familiar stories. A lot of the material for animation comes from the popular stage in terms of vaudeville, pantomimes, children's plays, and entertainments, and from comic strips. And this is material that had been reusing fairy tales for the last several decades, and that clearly fit into the stream. It was also a familiar story they could take and embellish and develop.
Were frantic with despair. They gnashed their teeth and stamped their feet and shouted to the mayor, "Rats, rats, rats!" The people cried, "We gotta get rid of the rats, get rid of the rats in Hamelin Town."
The fairy tales were ideal for Walt, I think. I don't think the fairy tales were detailed enough so that people knew exactly what they were going to get. Their minds were more open. And Walt, he would put personalities into each character that was in the thing and relate the personalities in an entertaining way and develop new ones if he needed to.
I'll rid your town of rats. I'll take the bag of gold. You rid the town of rats. You'll get this bag of gold.
Obviously, the fables and fairy tales are very successful with Disney. And the only conclusion you can draw from that is that they were damn good stories and that they were structurally very sound and believable, too. And indeed, in some of the Disney short subjects of that time, there was a great deal of respect paid to the original story. The Ugly Duckling, although they did a magnificent job on The Ugly Duckling, I think it's one of the best short subjects ever made. I'm a patsy for that kind of thing, but I'm not a patsy for fake emotion. This was so beautifully emotional.
Represented one of their first attempts to develop a real sense of pathos for an animated character. And for the first time, I think the animators began to understand they could really bring a sense of the tragic just to a collection of lines.
It was emblematic of all of the little experimenting we're doing. A lot of new guys coming into Disney Studios out of art school, anxious to learn the art of animation, and we're young, and we were all thinking of new ways of presenting old problems. And a lot of those things were evolved in that atmosphere.
Very often, Disney would be drawn to fables, not just because of the story, but because of the challenges they offered up for his animators. Here, it was how to animate speed.
When people saw the tortoise and the hare, other animators at other studios, they were all amazed because they had never seen a character look as if you were moving that quickly before.
In order to give any kind of a logical answer to the question as how the early silly symphonies affected all of us over there, you have to understand that we felt that they were making Rolls Royces and we were making Model T Fords. We never thought of ourselves as being in competition.
The films get progressively more moralistic as they go on. Early on, there's a certain magical quality to the animation, an anything goes quality. And that seems to get replaced as the Depression comes in with morals, rules, the way to succeed, the certain things you have to do to get through life. It probably has something to do with the times in which they were made.
He don't take no time to play, time to play, time to play. All he does is work all day.
You can play and laugh and fiddle. Don't think you can make me sore. I'll be safe and you'll be sorry when the wolf comes to your door.
Disney was a great believer in what we think of as the traditional American values, hard work and common sense and so forth. And certainly those messages come through in his films. And for example, in Three Little Pigs, it's the practical pig who has the sense to build his house of bricks and can therefore save his brothers and help them defeat the wolf.
I'll huff and I'll puff and I'll blow your house in.
This film became perhaps the most popular animated cartoon up to that time because it was a metaphor for the wolf at the door of the people during the Depression era. In fact, the song "Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Wolf" became a rallying cry. Gave them hope, as fairy tales do.
Who's afraid of the big bad wolf? Big bad wolf, big bad wolf. Who's afraid of the big bad wolf? I'll punch him in the nose. I'll tie him in a knot. I'll kick him in the chin. We'll put him on the spot.
Some animators and some producers and studios tried to emulate Disney and failed. The ones who succeeded were the ones who found their own voice and followed their own path. And when they did, one of the things they enjoyed doing was sometimes poking fun at Disney.
Waiting in the woods was a mean old wolf, ready to pounce upon poor little Red Riding Hood.
Oh, stop it!
Waiting in the woods with a mean old wolf ready to pounce on poor Red Riding Hood.
I'm fed up with that sissy stuff. It's the same old story over and over. If you can't do this thing a new way, bud, I quit.
Me too. Every cartoon studio in Hollywood has done it this way.
The shorts were not paying for themselves. Outside of the Three Little Pigs and maybe one or two others, they just didn't make enough money to run the studio the way Walt wanted to run it. And so he finally figured, well, we got to do something about that. So that's when he decided to make a feature. He and his brother Roy decided this is the only way to go. But I say if all the shorts had made as much money as Three Little Pigs, he might have made a 15-minute Snow White or a half-hour Snow White. It's conceivable.
I can't do it. Forgive me. I beg of your highness.
don't think that the studio ever thought of itself as being a place that did fairy tales. We were not aware that we were doing films that children would enjoy.
Disney was not sweet and saccharine, in my opinion. In no way many people would write and say that they thought he was frightening people too much.
If you look at the films, even, say, 50 years after they came out, those emotions still move you in the way they did people in the 30s.
Snow White was really the beginning of the great art form of this century to me, which was the animated film, as Walt did it.
The most important thing that Walt kept harping on was, this is not a cartoon. This is not 8 minutes that's going to run before the newsreel and the feature in the theater. This is a movie. It's got to have real characters you can believe in.
Disney had seen a live-action version of the Grimm brothers' Snow White as a child. Later, he realized the potential it offered his animators. The animation process begins with pencil drawings, which, if selected, are colored later on. The studios were at work on the feature for over 4 years, during which time they had to overcome the challenge of bringing a lifelike Snow White to the screen.
He wanted a character for that film more realistic than anything that had ever been attempted in animation before, and something that none of his artists knew if they could do or not. So before he gave them that challenge, he gave them other heroines, the sugar cookie girl, the goddess Persephone, a little blind girl doll, to try and see if they could do it. And if you look carefully, you can see a little bit of a rough draft for Snow White in them.
I'd like to be in the parade, but I haven't any pretty clothes to wear.
Now, don't be so downhearted. There's no need to cry. You're going to be the Cookie Queen, all alone the reason why. Got to fix your hair up. Here's the way to do it. There's nothing to it. You're going to be the sweetest one of all.
We're gonna get out of that dump. We're gonna get out of that dump.
For there lived a maiden, so gentle was she, that all the world...
We had a girl in there, and Walt was trying to see if the guys could draw a girl, and we had an animator who did. He had a nice-looking sister, and she posed for him, but she must have been kind of rubbery because the character turned out kind of rubbery, but Walt still felt that this was a step that he had to go through. And without a girl that the audience believed in, the picture wouldn't have come across.
They'd been shooting live-action reference footage to give the animators an idea of complicated movements, just to be able to look at that footage and see what are the order of the motions. Are the feet leading? Are the hands leading? How do the movements coordinate? In the traditional Grimm retelling of that story, the dwarves aren't differentiated at all. They're just sort of 7 generic dwarves. Disney knew that he would have to make personalities of them for them to work in the story.
Where did you learn to eat soup that way?
Oh, guess it just come natural. Anybody can do it with practice.
With the dwarves, you had 6 characters who looked alike and dopey, who had to, again, distinguish who they were by the way they moved, because they're very, very similar in their design. And just looking at a cell or a drawing, you may not be quite sure if it's happy or sneezy or sleepy if they're not doing anything particularly characteristic. But when you watch them move, you know which dwarf it is. And this was something that certainly no other studio could have done at that time.
With the zum, zum, zum of the music in your soup. Swing
For him to tackle a 90-minute film like Snow White after having done nothing but little 6- and 7-minute cartoons was an enormous undertaking. He'd look at it almost daily as the new sequences were coming in with pencil. And he was beginning to see by these repetitive showings things that were not necessary to the plot. He felt bad about the fact that he was going to have to take the soup sequence out, which I'd spent 8 grueling months with those dwarfs slurping and doing all these gags, and Snow White bawling them out, was not going to be in the picture.
That's perfect.
Even though I was heartbroken at the time, I had to agree with him. He had this sixth sense of what worked and what wasn't working, like any great author has.
The original story has a very unpleasant ending in that Snow White, when she marries the prince, the wicked queen is brought to the wedding and made to dance herself to death in red-hot iron shoes. Disney sensed this wouldn't play well, particularly with children, and simply lopped it off.
The audience already knows how it's going to come out, but they want to know how Walt Disney makes it come out. And he always insisted on a happy ending, of course.
This was the Depression, and no one wanted to go to the theater and pay their 25 cents or whatever to go and be depressed further. During the 30s, everyone was fascinated by Disney. People wrote about him. People like Aldous Huxley and H.G. Wells came to the studio. Frank Lloyd Wright came. They all wanted to see what was happening. Disney was someone important and interesting. After the war, he didn't seem to have that sort of importance, and he began to wonder if he had really lost his touch with his audience and the appeal. And it finally came down to the point where he had to make one feature and risk everything.
So he finally decided the only way, as he told me once, I got to get the stockholders and the bankers and the unions off my back. And the way I can do that is to put out another fairy tale that'll be successful. So he decided on Cinderella, and he wanted to be sure that he got the story right the first time. So we photographed the whole thing in live action.
Cinderella, Cinderella, night and day it's Cinderella. Make the fire, fix the breakfast, wash the dishes, do the mopping, and the sweeping, and the dusting. They always keep her hopping. She'd go around in circles till she's very, very dizzy. Still they holler, keep her busy, Cinderella. Yeah, keep her busy.
It was restrictive because you were sort of like you were nailed to the floor in a way. I could make minor changes, but not a lot. I had to stick pretty much to the live action we shot.
So this is love. So this is love. So this is what makes life mine. I'm all aglow. And now I know.
Cinderella is one of Disney's most underrated films. It's telling a familiar story, and it's doing it in a style of animation that by this time has become familiar as well. And I think it was taken for granted. Walt Disney's career, to me, is a classic example of what is meant by the phrase no-win situation. When he repeated things that he'd done before, he was accused of copying himself. So when he did something new and innovative, he was accused of presenting things people didn't want. And why didn't he just stick to the tried and true?
Oh, I'm awfully sorry. I didn't mean to frighten you.
Oh, it wasn't that. It's just that you're
A stranger?
Mm-hmm.
But don't you remember? We've met before.
We have?
Well, of course. You said so yourself. Once upon a dream.
There was a certain amount of pretentiousness in the way Sleeping Beauty was presented. It was the most expensive animated film anyone had made up to that time. It was very ambitious musically, it was ambitious visually, it was in widescreen and stereophonic sound, and had the name of Tchaikovsky attached to it.
Visions are seldom all they see.
What Disney really wanted from Sleeping Beauty, the animators say, was an illuminated manuscript in motion. He said, don't rush it, make it beautiful. Its look was largely created by an artist named Ivan Durrell.
In searching for a style for a cartoon feature, many considerations are necessary. For one thing, it must be more than merely pleasing to the eye. The backgrounds must harmonize with the animated characters, as well as fit the mood of the story and the music. Sleeping Beauty is a fairy tale that is supposed to have taken place long, long ago. So we did a great amount of research into medieval painting and architecture before we arrived at the right styling for this picture.
He worked from a variety of sources, looking back to the 15th century, to the paintings of Van Eyck, to the unicorn and multi-flower tapestries that he had seen in the Cloisters Museum in New York, and to certain medieval manuscripts, notably the Trésorier of Jean Duc de Berry. If you look at those manuscripts and then look particularly at the opening sequence of the film, you have this splendid procession that's very much a medieval Book of Hours come to life, with knights on horseback and ladies in gowns and banners floating in the wind. And it's an absolutely wonderful vision.
Sleeping Beauty, I've always blamed the sort of mediocre, to me, mediocre quality about it on the look of it. It's gorgeous. It's just absolutely stunning stuff. But it also has this quality of kind of cold reality to it. And I think when you tell fairy tales, you have to be really careful not to let too much reality intrude. The design of all of those tree trunks going up and down and all that sort of thing and all that bark and the leaves were little angular jobs, you know, if you look at it, that's what it is. And when you if you tried to put a real soft, round, lovable character in front of that background, you'd kind of look at it and say, well, that doesn't belong with that artwork.
Oh, we walk together and talk together. And just before we say goodbye, he takes me in his arms. And then...
I don't think that it has the warmth that either Snow White or Cinderella has. And at the time we were working on the story, Walt was so busy on other things, we had to almost beg him to come in and talk to us about the picture.
By that point, Walt was very busy with Disneyland, both the park and the TV show. He was busy with live action. He was busy with nature documentaries. And he had lost a lot of his interest in animation.
No, it cannot be!
I think in many ways he saw the films he was making then as repeats of what he had done before. He could still push them stylistically in terms of giving people a kind of visual beauty they had never seen on the screen before and really haven't seen since. But he didn't come to the meetings the way he had before, and he didn't watch the films as carefully as he had.
Despite the often spectacular animation, Sleeping Beauty, which cost over $6 million, became one of Disney's biggest box office failures, and it almost forced the company into bankruptcy. Doubt was cast on whether animated fairy tales were as valid for an audience in the late 50s and early 60s as they had been in the days of Snow White and Cinderella.
The 60s was kind of a bad time over here, and a lot of young people were staying away from Disney pictures at that time. There was this kind of now generation where everybody was trying all these things they shouldn't be and smoking marijuana and stuff. And I think that they just weren't interested in a cartoon.
There are a great many fairy tales that Disney thought about making and never did. There's a wealth of material in the Disney morgue, or the Animation Research Library, as they prefer to be called, that never saw the light of day. There are thousands and thousands of drawings. And Disney was the only studio who could afford to invest that much in a film and not make it because he decided it wasn't good enough or it wasn't working. Fairytale feature that was most developed that was never made was Chanticleer. That would have been the feature after 101 Dalmatians. And Mark Davis and Ken Andersen and Mel Shaw and a couple of other artists did thousands of beautiful drawings. Davis has said he feels the work for Chanticleer was some of the best he ever did at Disney. Some of the drawings that Mark did of the characters just cry out to be animated. There's so much movement and so much life in them. And that one, as I understand it, was not made because of financial considerations.
The business people of the studio went to Walt and they said, these features cost too much and they take too long. You've got to stop doing feature animated films. He, I guess, thought about it. So anyway, all of a sudden we were asked to have a meeting on Chanticleer. And a voice from the back of the room said, you can't make a personality out of a chicken. And it was like the signal, and they all walked out.
Chanticleer, having been so abruptly and perhaps brutally cut off when it showed such promise, put them off of fairy tales, and they may not simply have found a fairy tale that interested them.
I could make him understand. I just don't see things the way he does.
In the 1980s, the company was taken
They become legs, and she finally dies and ends up as sea foam.
I'm glad I didn't have to make the decision whether to kill Ariel in order to be faithful to Hans Christian Andersen. I don't know what decision I would have made. Again, I think when people go to see a Disney movie, particularly a Disney animated movie, they expect a happy ending. They don't not expect to see some terror along the way. And the villainy is part of the typical Disney mix, and even some horror at times.
The story itself is pretty short, so one of my first thoughts was to make the witch much more of a villain, and by doing that, that turned it into more of, I would say, like a good against evil story. And in a good against evil story, you don't want evil to win in the end. So that was part of it. I wouldn't say the original ending was impossible, but it would be a difficult thing, I think, to do for a Disney animated feature, because it was so sad.
I wouldn't change the ending on a classic novel. I wouldn't change the ending on a Fielding novel or a Bronte novel, but on a classic fairy tale that's kind of told from one generation to another, word to mouth, and it's not really written down that much, and it's been adapted from other cultures. I think we have the license to change the ending.
Following the success of The Little Mermaid, the studios turned their attention to another classic tale, Beauty and the Beast. It's become the most successful animated feature of all time, and the first ever to be nominated for an Academy Award as Best Picture.
Little town, it's a quiet village. Every day, like the one before. Little town.
As with The Little Mermaid, the film's a musical with a very contemporary sensibility.
Bonjour! 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 There goes the baker with his tray, like always. The same old bread and rolls to sell. Every morning just the same, since the morning that we came to this poor provincial town.
Good morning, Belle.
Morning, monsieur.
Where are you off to?
The bookshop. I just finished the most wonderful story about a beanstalk and an ogre and
That's nice. Marie! The baguettes! Hurry up!
They originally had planned it, as I understand it, as a much more serious film that was going to be in a very specific time and place, that is 18th century France. And the early sketches for the film do evoke the world of Fragonard and Boucher and that whole 18th century Rococo elegance.
There's versions of this story in all kinds of different cultures, and like American Indian legends, and there's versions in from ancient China and ancient Egypt. That just in readings through mythology you can see the parallels. But the most clear version that that I'm familiar with, like intimately familiar with, was the Cocteau version.
The version from the world of the fairy tales that we probably drew on the most was probably the one that most people are familiar with, the French court tales of the 16th or 17th century. One of the things that we found when we were working with the original story was that it had a very static, somewhat dull middle section that worked fine when you read it. Yet, as a film, it tended to slow the action. And that was when Beauty finally arrived at the Beast's castle, and made the agreement to exchange her life for her father's and stay there forever. In the fairy tale, that section was usually filled with Belle and the Beast having dinner night after night, and the Beast asking Belle, "Will you marry me?" And Belle saying, "No, Beast, I will not marry you." The next night, the Beast would say, "Will you marry me?" And she'd say, "No, Beast, I will not marry you." And, you know, so on and so on.
Belle, voulez-vous être ma femme?
Non, la bête.
Adieu donc, Belle. À demain.
Whereas that worked nicely for the original fairy tale, it seemed a little bit dull. We needed some way to energize it.
Be our guest. Be our guest. Put our service to the test. Tie your napkin round your neck, chérie, and we provide the rest. Soup du jour, hot hors d'oeuvre. Why, we only live to serve. Try the gray stuff, it's delicious. Don't believe me? Ask the dishes. They can sing, they can dance. After all, miss, this is France. And a dinner here is never second best.
We've contemporized the characters a little bit. We've created a story that speaks a little more to today's audiences, and I think that's because of the time we spent trying to make Belle and the Beast in particular genuine three-dimensional characters, not just cardboard cutouts.
The intimidating thing about it is when you're going to do a Disney character, a Disney heroine, a Disney something that's classic, like a fairy tale character, the Disney version becomes the definitive version. Nobody remembers what Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs looked like before Disney's version of them. And now kids will grow up thinking Beast is Beast, but he wasn't that way for quite a while. I wanted to steer away from any of those things that people had seen before, so the best way was to go out and look in nature and find something that's real that inspires you. That's really what we do here, is you take from the world around you and you present it back to the audience in a way they've never seen it before. It's one thing to read these stories in children's books and to look at a picture, oh, there's Beauty and she's next to the Beast, and oh, I hope they fall in love. And it's another thing for you to stand this close to a 600-pound pile of muscle and fury.
Come into the light.
No, Belle! I won't let you do this!
You have my word.
Done!
There's no other art form today that has the disciplines of the past like animation does. What we do here is built on other artists. Like for the transformation of Beast, I studied a lot of Michelangelo's sculptures. He has sculpted these figures half coming out of the rock, and they're not quite freed from the rock, and they're not conscious, but they're just sort of breaking out of it. And that's what I was thinking with Beast as he's transforming. So did a lot of drawings based on that.
I think we will continue to look at fairy tales forever for this medium, because the medium suits that kind of a story. You feel the weight of tradition. looking over your shoulder saying, if you're going to do one of these things, you better do it pretty good. But on the other hand, there is that guy looking over your shoulder from somewhere, you know, that you have to respect and make sure you live up to.
Aesop, La Fontaine, the brothers Grimm, and Hans Christian Andersen. Down through the ages, the fables and stories of these talented men have been told and retold. And they'll be told and retold for years to come.
When you wish upon a star, makes no difference who you are. Anything your heart desires will come to you. If your heart is in your dream, no request is too extreme. When you wish upon a star, as dreamers do, fate is kind.